Colin, it's okay. There's nobody here. We're just being patient. No, it's okay. There's no Cronenberg in this house. It's okay.
Welcome. You are entering a strange realm. A realm of what-ifs. What if movies, television shows, and video games were better, worse, bizarrer, or downright different? What might they look like? Find out on today's episode of CineCasters.
Hello, and welcome to CineCasters, the show where we watch movies, we analyze them, we talk about them, and then we pitch them back to each other to try and reconstruct and reconfigure and figure out what themes are working and how to reconfigure characters to try and come up with something more interesting and more unique, possibly, hopefully, but we enjoy doing it. I am Nate Draper. I'm joined as always by my very good friend, Janglez.
You kind of lost me at the end there
because I said reconfigure twice.
No, that was fine. It was okay. It was more the part where you were just like, because we like to do it. Hopefully, I was like, whatever, it's fine.
Yeah,
it's all good.
I sort of realized I was starting to run on a bit.
That's all right.
Anyway,
it was a solid intro. I'm not mad about
thank you.
It, yeah.
Okay, well that's in. Anyway, today we are doing Robocop, not the original, the remake of the original from 2014.
Yeah. So not the sequel.
Not the sequel. Not Robocop 2. Not Robocop
2.
3.
Not Robocop 3. Was there a Robocop?
There was a Robocop 3.
Was there a Robocop 4?
Actually, I can't remember. I can't remember if there was a 4. I did actually see part of, it was either 3. If there is a 4, it might have been 4. Anyway, there is multiple Robocop movies. Yeah. But today we're only doing the remake.
We're doing the remake of the original, like 2014.
It's got Gary Oldman in it and Michael Keaton in it and
Samuel L. Jackson.
Sam Jackson's in it, right?
And what was her name? Jessica Ellie? Hale?
It's like spelled E-H-L-Y, I believe.
Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, there was lots of crazy people popping up all over the place.
And our favorite Canadian, Jay
Baruchel.
Yeah.
And we can't forget, Lewis is played by...
Omar from The Wire.
I can't think of the actor's name. It's something Eric something William or something.
I can't remember.
Yeah. Phenomenal actor who recently passed away.
Unfortunately, yeah.
But yeah, so if you're unfamiliar, last week we did Robocop. We've been on a Paul Verhoeven kick.
That's right.
Interestingly, a lot of Paul Verhoeven's movies have been remade.
And I was thinking about that while we were watching. I was like, there's actually quite a few of them, aren't there?
Quite a few of them.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is we've been basically...
Michael Kenneth Williams.
I knew it was Williams something. Yeah. What's interesting about this sort of kick is that Paul Verhoeven's movies are remembered quite fondly. And we've been going on about like how we think that Verhoeven is like a master of deception in terms of how he hides, particularly the way the media is portraying or is portrayed in his movies, and how that reflects on us watching the movie itself and how he's delivering media to us. And so there's a lot of commentary that way. And for some reason they get remade a lot, or at least 2 of them. There might be more that have been remade. And
there's only 2 that I can think of off the top of my head.
This is the second one. If you haven't seen us do the original Robocop that came out last week, go check that one out. Mm-hmm. But this one we're doing the remake to see like what's the difference between how we remade or are remaking Paul Verhoeven and how other people are doing it, and are they missing something? Are we missing something? Or what's going on there? Just honestly, we just want to talk about Paul Verhoeven.
I feel like it's also a really interesting way to kind of it makes whatever sort of mechanisms were in the first movie more apparent, because I guess you would on some level have a similar story, and so you're able to see kind of what structure, like how story structure, the conventions of storytelling are being employed in both, and by comparing the 2, you can see
what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I'm noticing that with when we did Total Recall. What I noticed is that I don't think that the second movie works to the same, or the remake worked to the same extent as the original.
Yes, yeah.
And I think the reason for that is because even though it's basically the same story, the nuances around like memories and how the story is told to us are very different.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that actually ruins the effect.
Yeah.
With this movie, with Robocop, I felt like there was a concerned and like hard push to keep the idea of media in the focus, but it's less satirical.
Yeah.
It is, and it's clearly biased, and that's part of the point of the story.
Right.
It's clearly like supposed to be we're on the bias of behalf of we want robots in the like in the police force. We want them to be on U.S. soil.
Right.
And the Novak element, which is used largely as a narrative device, a framing device, is very pro robots. And it is the media still telling it, but I don't think I still don't think it has the same level of depth.
I think the way it's working in this one, I think it's more of I think you could explicitly tie it to more of like a Chomskyan like manufacturing consent.
Yes, but I still don't think it's as smart as that.
I don't think it is either. I'm just saying in terms of how it functions in the world of this RoboCop movie, that's how I sort of interpreted it, where it's like the bias is clear to us, the audience, because it's indicating that, oh, this is a mainstream news source that's actually pushing a very specific agenda.
Yeah, and it's clearly like in bed with certain like corporations and also like politically affiliated people and like certain political standings and parties, and like is clearly shutting down other things that are happening and going on in order to make it look a certain way. It's interesting that you brought up Chomsky. In my pitch, I actually went like hard into the Chomsky manufacturing consent, because that's what I kind of thought this was going to do, and it never quite got there.
Right.
But there was a specific point in the story that I'll just say it now, when he was like talking to the reporter at the very beginning, before we are even introduced to RoboCop or any of our really main characters. We get this sort of news report from the Novak element, and he's got this reporter on the ground in Tehran.
Yeah, it's Tehran.
Yeah.
Which looked nothing like Tehran that I've been to.
Yeah. But in Tehran, and she's like reporting, and at the end he straight up says like, oh, we're going to have to cut because the Pentagon doesn't want to like reveal any more footage. And I was like, I know why they're cutting. It's like, oh, we don't, but there was something in that particular moment where I was like, I'm going to do something with that in my pitch.
Right.
So I'm going to leave that as a little breadcrumb.
Okay.
So if you're listening, you're going to be like, I need to go ahead to Andrew's pitch. But I'm going to leave that as a breadcrumb. There's something that I thought was very, very important about that scene, and they didn't do anything with it. And I was kind of frustrated.
Yeah, that's interesting. I felt like this movie, compared to the last one,
like RoboCop, or compared to Total Recall?
Compared to RoboCop, the original. Okay. I felt like it was not as clear that it was making. I mean, there was like we just talked about with the scenes with Samuel L. Jackson. There is a kind of a critique on the media, but the way in which that sort of functions as a Marxist critique of like people themselves being like products, and how media is effectively like how it becomes cyclical. That was the thing that I actually really liked about the original that I felt was kind of missing in this one.
The only thing that really, like, the idea of the product, they talk about the product a little bit in this one. The only thing that really came across that to me was that he was owned by Omnicorp.
Right. Yeah.
And there was a very, very telling scene where he's in China at the Omnicorp facility and escapes and is turned off.
Right.
And he's in a rice field, and they just like functionally turn him off.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's interesting. He's literally made in China.
Yeah.
Like, and we think about our products that way. However, this theme is basically ignored. They don't do a lot in terms of like his product, him being like a unit, a product. What they did replace that with, I thought was pretty interesting though. Because they did replace him, instead of being a product, a unit, they did replace him with the idea of being a machine.
Right.
And there were some interesting... They weren't brought to, like, the smartest conclusions.
Right.
But there was some interesting ideas about how consciousness works, and how, like, how much
will.
A machine versus free will. I thought it was really interesting, and I wish they would have got into this. I thought it was really interesting that they wanted... or were talking about how, like, they reduced his, like, emotional... or like, I guess they kept referring to like the soul, but for lack of a better word, we'll use that. They like subdued it until he basically became a machine. And I was like, I think that what they could have played with more there, and really should have, is this idea that all people really are machines.
Yeah.
And you're like removing they're like, well, he's a human in a robot, and by removing all the things that made him human, they essentially created another robot.
Yeah, exactly.
And for me, I was like, I think it would have been interesting if they'd gone into this idea of like, well, actually, like, aren't we all just programmed robots?
Yes, exactly.
And he just happens to be like the one where we think, oh, he doesn't have any humanity, when it's like, but what is humanity in terms of like how we're programmed? Are we talking about a socialized idea of what it means to function as a human being.
Yeah, so I'm just making a note because that actually you gave me a good idea for my pitch.
I that's in my pitch as well. So.
But the thing that I thought, and they introduced it, was the whole question of illusion of choice versus free will. That was, and you actually vocally at that point when it came up were like, that's interesting.
Oh yeah, we watched this movie together. Yeah. We don't normally do that, but we did that again this time.
And and I felt the same way at that moment. I went, oh, that's an interesting idea.
But they don't do anything.
But they don't really follow through with it. Yeah, the whole like, well, okay, like I think if they were to have continued with that, the next scene that they should have had was like him talking to his wife. And then, like, either the doctor or his wife, like, him, like, well, he with you, he'll actually be able to, like, do this and actually be more affectionate. And his wife going, like, oh, yeah, so is he still himself? And the doctor saying, like, he is technically, he thinks he's doing this.
Yeah.
You know, and then see how that affects his relationship with his wife. Like, there was a way in which they could have implemented that and followed it through.
I wonder, actually, because there's a division, they talk about the division between the visor up, visor down, and that, like, changes his mode of, like, thinking. So when the visor's up, it's him in control. When the visor's down, it's him thinking he's in control, but it's the machine operating him.
Right.
So the machine's operating him. So he literally becomes a machine that thinks it's a man.
Right.
When the visor's off, he's a man who thinks he's a machine.
Right.
Interesting dichotomy. I wonder actually if it would have been more interesting for them to be like, we not tell him this.
Yes,
So
exactly.
not tell Alex this, and not make a distinction between whether the visor's up or down, and just say like he's always like this.
That's what I
but
thought.
Then
would
tell
be
his wife. And so the entire time,
okay.
he himself is like, well, I'm always in control.
Right.
But we, the audience, have been like, are you?
Right.
That you're a machine that thinks you're Alex, that thinks you're a machine.
Yeah.
But his wife goes like, oh, I wanted him to come back to life, but I didn't realize that in order for him to come back to life, it was actually like a machine dictating his consciousness.
It was going to come at a cost, yeah.
So now he is alive, but it's a machine dictating his consciousness, which makes her sort of feel like, wait a second, like, is this a machine playing at being my husband?
Right.
Or is this actually my husband? And how much of this is like, how much of consciousness is actually programming? Whether that programming is code or socialization.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that would have just been one way they could have gone with it. And I think this film, there was too many threads in a way that just didn't quite connect. Like there was a story with Gary Oldman. Like I think you're right.
It's Frankenstein.
Yeah, exactly. Gary Oldman's kind of actually really is the central character in my opinion.
And I agree. I actually think the most compelling parts of this movie are actually the emotional parts and the philosophical parts when Alex is with his family. And when Gary Oldman is contending with
Michael Keaton.
I
thought those were the most interesting scenes.
Or with Alec. Like when Gary Oldman is, or Denton Norton, which is a terrible like name just to say out loud, but Denton Norton, when he is
Denton Norton.
When he is contending with Alex Keaton like philosophically and socially, but then also with the ramifications of like any scene that he has with Michael Keaton usually ends up with him having to make concessions on how much of Alex's humanity he's allowed to leave him. But any scene that Alex has with his wife that Denton is usually involved with usually wind up with him being like, I want to give Alex more. I want to give him more humanity. Right. And what we wind up with is like this sort of like, in a very basic way, this dichotomy between like efficiency versus humanity.
Right.
And I think that's just a really interesting like Dr. Frankenstein complex for the Gary Oldman character to be caught in between like, I have the funding to do this, to keep this man alive, but in order to keep him alive, I have to make him less of a man.
Right, yeah.
That is a way more interesting central narrative if Michael Keaton is the main character, as opposed to Alex Murphy, Robocop.
Right, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, but that would have required a certain focus on, like, you know, there would be certain things that they would have had to have stripped away and made that the sort of the focus.
I think that's a stronger story, though.
Well, no, exactly. My point is that the current film doesn't have that focus.
No, it doesn't,
and required that focus.
I honestly wonder, like, if I put it to you, if you had infinite time, I would just be like, what if we just took this movie, not reshoot anything, but we just took this movie, and I just was like, Nate, could you cut this movie to make it so Michael Keaton is the main character?
Right.
Do you think you could? I'm not saying you should. I'm saying, do you think it based on what we just watched? I know you've only seen it one time. Do you think you might be able to like make a cut of this movie that frames Michael Keaton as the main character with Murphy as a side character?
Ooh, no, not Michael Keaton.
No, sorry, not Michael Keaton.
Oh, Gary Oldman?
Gary Oldman.
Yes, I think
Yeah.
Gary Oldman, yeah.
I think Michael Keaton has to be a villain, if not the villain, because I actually think this movie is better about not having a villain.
Right, yeah.
I think the original movie has a pretty clearly defined, like, who the villains are.
Right.
And that's very 80s. So that's very... Paul Verhoeven would have had fun with that.
Yeah,
and he
yeah.
does have fun with that.
Yeah, yeah.
Versus in this movie, I think Michael Keaton is our quote-unquote antagonist, but I wouldn't call him, like, the villain in the normal sense.
I feel like at the end, though, he kind of becomes a villain on the scene on the rooftop.
Yes, he does sort of...
Like,
and
I could shoot you, I could shoot your wife and son.
Yeah.
And at that point, I went,
and
really?
when he
That
does
just
the wife
seems-
and when he does the wife and son thing,
Yeah.
he clearly puts himself in, like, the stereotypical villain role.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he didn't have to do that. What
No,
I think is more
exactly.
interesting is if he has, like, the I'm a red... Like, anyone who
Yeah.
has that red band is, like, a red asset.
Yeah, yeah.
And they can't be harmed. And I think it would have been more interesting if it was, like... He doesn't pull a gun out because he's not a threat. He's a red asset. How does Alex overcome that as a cop?
Robocop.
As a Robocop? And eventually what he does is go like, no, I'm going to arrest you.
Yeah.
Like, and that's his humanity showing through. Because I think that's the goal of the movie.
Yeah.
Is to show us that But this movie, I don't know. This movie is very clearly like technology versus humanity. And I don't think that's a simple dichotomy.
No. Yeah, I think... I'm having a hard time pinning it down to kind of what sort of things there's a lot of things that are introduced and sort of haphazardly sort of put on display as like, oh, this is something that we could explore and this is something the characters are thinking about, but it's kind of like thrown in your face for a minute and then taken away. And then we quickly move on to something else. And I felt like for me a lot of it was there were points where I was going, okay, wait, how is this related to what was, because I know I can go, okay, now he's going to the gangster hideout and he's shooting up the gangsters. Okay, I get it, they're the bad guys, but I'm still, in terms of how everything's sort of progressing emotionally, I'm having a hard time seeing how this isn't just like, and now this happens, and now this happens, and now this happens.
What I did find, I thought the central theme, like I said, I think the stronger theme was actually like Alex Murphy dealing with his wife Clara and son David. I think the emotional scenes there are actually the strongest points. Like them dealing with, like, because I think there is a version of this movie that could be rewritten to actually be about like soldiers and people who are harmed in the line of battle,
right?
And how they have to like be rehabilitated and how their family dynamics change,
right?
Because at one point in time, Alex was an able-bodied officer who was a breadwinner and was seen as like a hero, and now he comes back, and I think there's a lot of people who have served in the line of duty who now feel like they're useless. And I think there's a strong emotional thing that could have been tied in there. There's
actually a Black Mirror episode that plays with that.
Yeah. Man, we talk a lot about the Black Mirror.
I mean, because it's kind of like it's kind of the, I'd say, the quintessential, at least contemporary story of like our relationship with technology that a lot of people are familiar with and has had mainstream success. Yeah, and I quite enjoy watching.
I quite enjoy it too.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting at there is I think that emotional story is actually really quite, and there was a couple times where I even vocally said out loud, like, we're cut on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Like where I was like, but that's the part that's
exactly
making me want to watch more.
Yeah, exactly.
But this is an action movie, and we'll get to that. But for me, I think the central conflict was always coming back to the politics of the bill.
Okay, yeah.
The bill that's the Dreyfus bill,
yeah.
right? Coming back on, are we going to repeal the Dreyfus bill? Or are we going to let robots work, drones or whatever, work on American soil? And I think that's the central plot to me. What I think is interesting about that is and they go in too many places, I think, to make that stick really well. But what I think is interesting is that a large part of what we see as Omnicorp is their CEO, Michael Keaton, his right-hand woman, and Jay Baruchel, the Canadian, playing their marketing department.
Right.
And that's pretty much the face of Omnicorp.
Yeah.
And Gary Oldman's character. Right. That's the face of Omnicorp, and I think it's interesting that they include the marketing in there. So we don't really see the entirety of the business. We just see those making the big decisions.
Yeah.
So I do think it's interesting that we're talking about the marketing. What the difference between that theme and what we might find in a Paul Verhoeven film is that the Novak element as a show is used as a framing device, not as a media directed at the audience.
Right.
Like, it is directed at us, the audience, but it feels like artificial.
Yeah, it's
Whereas-
sort of
Go on.
So what I was going to say is it's like, okay, so Foucault in The Order of Things, he talks about the painting Les Minas.
Yes.
Where you see it's like he's painting somebody, but then you also see it's a reflection. You see there's a mirror in the background
of him.
So it's like you're looking at the painter who's painting you, and you can actually see the reflection in the background of you. So it's like it's reflecting back on itself. And so you have this, your relationship to it is you're looking at it and you're going like, what's my relationship to what I'm watching?
Exactly.
Whereas this would be like you have the elements.
That's classic
in it.
Verhoeven.
Exactly.
Yeah,
in this you have moments where in the world there seems to be something about the media that's dissonant and not in unison with what's actually going on.
And it's clearly like directed at you, but there's no reflection.
But
asking
you don't
to
get
watch
that
back.
Exactly. You don't get that sort of reflexivity coming back at you with it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. Because and I feel like that's what's missing from this is there's a lot of this media attention talking about the media. They draw attention to the media, but we're missing this reflexive. Like, are you aware of what you're watching? Beyond the narrative itself.
Yeah, exactly.
And I felt like this was a framing device, not a reflexive question.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's how I would frame it.
Yeah, that's a much better way to put it. Yeah. Good. Action sequences in this movie.
What did you think?
I actually, despite the budget in this movie, I was really frustrated with the action sequences.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is there's a lot of shaky cam.
Right. Which can work
I
in
think
other movies.
Yes. All right. No, my problem was
Sorry.
the big action sequence in the warehouse where he finally like gets the bad guy or
The,
whatever.
is that the test sequence? That one?
No, that one test sequence was really hard to follow, but at least it was lit.
Right.
The scene where they're shooting in the
it's
darkness,
just all lit with the muzzle flashes.
it's all lit with muzzle flashes. That's a really neat idea, and I think it could work. And I've actually seen it work
in
the Punisher.
Dark Knight Rises.
The Dark Knight Rises, but I was thinking of in Punisher season 2. There's a very similar scene in like a parking garage, where it's lit by strobe lights because they're trying to like get Frank off guard.
Okay.
The Punisher off guard,
Right.
And it's such an interesting, well lit scene because they can do a lot of really like brutal maneuvers, but because you're only seeing bits and pieces of it, they can sort of get away with the rating.
Interesting.
But the Punisher, the point a lot of the Punisher is the violence, and the violence is supposed to make you uncomfortable.
Right.
So I think they can get away with it,
Right.
and I think it works there. In this, it did not work for me.
Yeah,
I had a hard time telling what was going on. They relied on like other indicators that were animated on top as like filters of what Robocop was from Robocop's perspective as what he was seeing to help them tell the story. And I think if you have to add those in, then your camera work isn't telling me enough.
Yeah. I found the actual visual geography, the way things were staged, was very confusing. And
You mean on the whole movie?
The whole movie,
Yeah.
we were watching. There was one sequence we actually stopped and rewatched a particular edit
from the very beginning.
times.
Yeah,
like right at the there was a scene. It's one of the first scenes where they're in the courtroom talking about this bill.
Yeah,
and there's this one edit where it's basically it's a shot of Michael Keaton, and then it basically cuts into a tighter shot of Michael Keaton, and it jumps the eye line, and it's really jarring. But like that was just one example where there were moments like that one was the most egregious for me, but there were definitely times throughout the movie where I was going like, oh, this, like you were saying, the visual geography, I'm confused. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
So
I will say that there were some nice references to the original movie. Mm-hmm. There's the one
the
point
theme song,
the theme song at the very beginning. That was a nice to hear that Robocop theme again.
Mm-hmm.
There was also, and it came in again when he first came into the police station. We got the Robocop theme again.
I wouldn't pay $2. I wouldn't
buy that for $1 when he was like, oh, your tin man is like a defective product. I wouldn't buy that for $1. And it was like, oh, that's a nice reference, but. It's interesting that they reference like the media, the part of the media, but they don't really reference how the media works in Paul Verhoeven's movie.
It's true, yeah.
I don't understand how Paul Verhoeven like comes up with these ideas. They're so interesting.
I would love to find
some interviews,
like some interview where he talks about that, because all I remember years ago, there's someone who I know who was an art director or a storyboard artist, but he actually had met Paul Verhoeven, and I hadn't even seen Starship Troopers, but I remember him talking about working with Paul Verhoeven and like
on Starship Troopers.
I can't remember if it was Starship Troopers, but if it was something else. But talking with him about Starship Troopers, and he was like, he was really thinking about like like media and control, and so it's like, okay, I have that as kind of a, my reference as a, like, this is someone who was, I'm not just maybe reading into it, but I would love to see more of him saying, okay, when I did this was the, the rationality behind it.
But just how he comes up with his ideas, and why when his movies get remade, people like explicitly seem to lose that. The point.
Yeah, exactly. Like, especially, I think the one where it was most noticeable, because I felt like with this, there was some of that there.
They were really paying attention to the media. The Novak element, I thought, was a really interesting take while still doing it in a different direction.
Yeah.
And it's not as smart. It was at least an interesting take.
Yeah. And it was there. It was present with the Total Recall remake versus the original. I felt like a lot of that was just
missing.
Absent. Yeah.
It was just like
it felt
totally
like
absent.
Yeah. I my opinion of that was, when I got to the end, was I feel like they missed the point of Total Recall.
Yeah. I had asked you, and I think I said this last week too. I had asked you, do you think at the end of the original, if it was false memories or that was real, versus the remake, did you think it was false memories or real?
Right. Yeah.
And when I asked you, you outright said, I don't think that's the point.
Yeah, exactly.
And in the original movie, I absolutely agree with you. In the original movie, I don't think that's the point. The point of the movie isn't that whether you know or not. I just wanted your opinion on it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But in the remake, 100%, it feels like there's a definitive answer, and it feels like that's the point.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it feels like it's not asking any questions about that. It's just that's the point of the movie. Robocop doesn't have the same kind of ambiguity in terms of like the end of the story.
Right. Is it real? Not real?
Not real. There's none of that in Robocop. In Robocop, what I felt like was more interesting was how the media was portrayed in relationship to us, the watcher, and us, the the people viewing media in universe. Whereas people viewing media in universe, or like the Novak element is clearly reaching out of the screen to us, but it doesn't have that reflexive thing like we were talking about. Whereas anybody who's watching media in the remake of Robocop, there isn't this question of like, what are they watching?
Right.
How are they being socialized? They're usually watching the news, and usually because it's relevant to the story
it's
in order
something
to move the plot
that they
along.
want to get out of it. Yeah.
But it's usually relevant because they're watching it because narratively it makes sense for their character, and we're seeing them watch it because they need to convey some plot element exposition wise to us, the audience. It's very utilitarian. It has nothing to do with the themes of media.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm missing here. That's what I'm missing. Because I think that was such a big part of RoboCop that we talked about last time, is this I wouldn't buy that for $1, that TV show.
That keeps coming back. Yeah.
And the way that they treat women.
The whole thing with the spinning the gun.
Yeah.
He saw it on TV, and now he's going back to the house, and he's remember seeing it on TV. And so like, well, wait, is like, so now he as a robotic entity, as an artificial entity, is being shaped by something that he saw on television.
Yeah. So how much of his like robotic design is informed by his socialization of a fictional robot?
Yeah, exactly.
In the media, right?
Yeah.
There's none of that in this. And while I do think it's an interesting, maybe if not very deep, it's at least asking some questions about like machine versus man versus humanity. I still think that dichotomy of like one or the other. I think RoboCop is interesting because if we want to get like Hegelian about it, Hegel has this idea called the synthesis.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Or he calls it the dialectic.
Yes,
so instead of Plato's dialogue, where we have like machines are best, humans are best, and then Plato would say, you argue the two and the superior argument would win.
Right.
Yeah. In this case, I think that this movie is outright saying like humanity is superior.
Better. Yeah.
In actuality, according to Hegel, what we get is a dialectic, not a dialogue, where the two arguments are thrust at each other, and instead of the superior argument winning, you wind up with a synthesis of both arguments' stronger points with a new outcome that is not one is better than the other, but that there are parts of both arguments that have validity, and putting them together creates a stronger argument. That in fact, Alex himself is a synthesis of humanity and robotics.
Right. Oh, that's interesting.
And that's what I think could be a very interesting point. However, I know that a lot of people are against the singularity, or against this fusion of like roboticism, and humanity. And I think there's an actual fear of that. So another way,
technophobia.
I think there's a way that like, I wonder. We were talking about this earlier today, but I wonder what Cronenberg would do with RoboCop. In terms of like, like a body horror version.
Right.
Of
Well,
RoboCop.
first of all, he would give RoboCop a giant robotic dildo.
Of course, we were talking about that too.
Yeah, and there would be like some crazy like car crash, and then he'd like go have this like wild sex scene.
Yeah. with like I said, like an egg beater.
Yeah,
it's like an egg beater down there.
Yeah.
But I was thinking like what would Cronenberg do with this in terms of like technophobe? Actually, he has a movie that came out recently that sort of talks a little bit
of the
about
Future.
this. I think it's Crimes of the Future.
I haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
But I think it's more genetics rather than robotics.
Yeah, his more tends to deal with like biology and
but I think that there's like a body horror element mixed with like
for sure, yeah.
And I think and that's what I'm wondering. I'm like, what would Cronenberg do with RoboCop?
Yeah.
Because I think he would ask questions about like how much integration.
Like, what does this mean about
much?
me as a person? Like how human am I still? Yeah.
Is it Prey or is it Soma? The game where you actually like
you are a robot. In Soma.
In Soma, you're a robot.
In Soma, you discover that you're actually your memories have been implanted into a robot in the future.
Yeah. In Prey, I think it's the game Prey. Correct me if I'm wrong. Where you there are these turrets that are around, but as you go through the game, you can like upgrade yourself with more like alien technology.
Okay.
But if you upgrade yourself too far, the turrets that are there for security start like recognizing you as a threat. And so you start to get to this point where like, how much do you want to give up your humanity, or what does it mean to be human in order to...
Oh, that's interesting.
So this is why I think the synthesis, this idea of the Hegel synthesis is actually really interesting in terms of RoboCop and in terms of like this body horror. You know, is Alex in fact still human if he has a prosthetic? And we can talk about prosthetics as a philosophical concept or a Freudian concept if you want to go down that route too, right? So like, how much of your humanity is integrated or how much of it is made better by prosthetics versus how much of it is actually less human, and what does that mean to be human? I don't know. I think there's an interesting
for sure
aspect of not just like the psychological humanity but the physical humanity as well.
Exactly. I think with Cronenberg you get a little bit more on that end of it.
I think you get both. I think Cronenberg
for sure. I
think Cronenberg would do a great way of being like, let's do some nasty body horror with technology that is grotesque and is making you ask questions about the psychology of humanity.
I think with Cronenberg it'd be like this question of like where does my body end and like begin, and is there like, and then what does that mean about me as something that's a thinking, feeling entity? And
is there a limitation to like how much horror and technology my body can handle? So not even like in a Borgian sense, like from Star Trek or the Borg, like not even, I'm not talking about like how much humanity you can wipe out. I'm talking about like how much technology could your physical body handle in a horror kind of way until you can no longer physically be human because you can't handle the kind of implants they're adding. That sounds Cronenberg.
Exactly.
That, and that's interesting. Like that. And I do think it's also like very...
with some like heads exploding and some like weird centipede things and
I do think because I think it's interesting. You could ask. I think we're just pitching a Cronenberg RoboCop.
Cronenberg RoboCop,
and I'm okay with it because I think it would be interesting. Like I'm just thinking about in terms of a like this I can't remember who came up with this idea, but this reflexive need. It could be Nietzsche. This reflexive need to like add a shadow of ourselves into our creations. Because in RoboCop, there is a need to try and keep, and this stems from marketing, but there's a need to try and keep Alex looking human enough.
Right. Yeah.
And I wonder if maybe in alternate versions, like we find out in this Cronenberg version, we find out that RoboCop is actually not the first time they've tried. And the reason that they're going with him is because he's the most human looking, and we find these like centipede robot human hybrids like in different shapes and forms because they've tried to be like how much can we push the limits of humanity before people no longer associate it with human in terms of like technological shape and grotesqueness. Oh fuck, I'm creeping myself out just thinking about this. It's a good idea.
Ooh, I like that a lot. We'll just have to walk up to Cronenberg's door and knock on the door and be like,
"Excuse me, Mr. Cronenberg."
Oh, I also have to say, I have to just comment on the whole Iran sequence at the beginning.
Okay, I fixed that in my pitch, and I did that purposefully.
Oh yeah,
but go ahead and
I just didn't include
that
because when it first came on, I thought, okay, well, if they're doing the whole critique on the media thing, I could see how this is a like comment on the like propaganda system,
but they don't talk about it.
But they don't, and I was kind of pissed off about how it's like, okay, wait, so we're in Iran, and now everyone is like radical extremist Muslims, and
not everyone was, but it was very conveniently
the characters
placed.
Characters who interact with the other characters were, and that was essentially what was causing the tension. And I looked at it and I was like, this is the Tehran doesn't look like this. It was actually, I will say, and maybe I'll go first with my pitch this time, because this like leads right into it. It was actually your comment about that's not the Tehran you remember. That actually informed how my pitch looks. Interesting. Yeah.
Because when you were talking about that, I was like, yeah, I totally see what you're talking about. And then there was that, I left that breadcrumb earlier. There was that part where he's like, we're going to have to cut off your feed because the Pentagon has security reasons, where I was like, we're going to do something with that. And they didn't. But it was your comment as we were watching the movie where I was like, I know exactly where my movie's going to go. And I know how I want to do this.
Interesting.
So I'm going to get right into my pitch if that's okay.
Sure. Go for it. Yeah.
So my pitch starts out with the Novak element the same way. And it's my whole movie is presented as though we're getting Robocop in a kind of 60 seconds. This is a documentary about the story of Alex Murphy and how he became Robocop. So we're getting this story told to us by the Novak element.
Okay.
This is like, so it would be introduced like, welcome to the Novak element. Tonight's story, we're doing a deep dive into the story, like the story you all know. Right. It's Alex Murphy as Robocop. You know what I mean?
It's sort of like the Starship Troopers thing.
Yes, except it's clearly not propaganda.
Right.
It's much more like 60 seconds. It's a news like, oh, we're doing a documentary or a deep dive into the story of Robocop. Yeah,
it's like the profile of Robocop.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking very 60 seconds.
Right. Okay.
If you're familiar with.
Yes. No, I know what you mean.
So, and basically mine is set up so that Denton Norton is the main character, and RoboCop is weirdly treated. Like as they go through the story is following Denton Norton,
and that's the Gary Oldman.
That's Gary Oldman's character.
Okay.
It's following Denton Norton as the main character and how he came to this like idea of making RoboCop and how OmniCorp is a part of that. And we do get Captain Murphy's story, but it's not told from his perspective. And we do get some of his it would be told like he's leaving behind a wife and a kid, and we get like shots of the wife and kid and how the kid's been growing up and how much harder it is for Clara to leave her husband behind, and how David is really, really suffering from not having a father, and sort of how this is affecting his like social life at school and stuff like that. And we'll come back to this idea, but for me, Gary Oldman is the main character.
Okay, got it.
So as they go through this whole thing, we get this whole idea of like, as we're seeing glimpses of Alex Murphy as this RoboCop character, and how that comes about, but it's all told from as though they're following Denton Norton, like I said.
Oh, okay, right.
And basically the whole thing would come down to this idea of like how much Gary, like I talked about earlier, how much Gary Oldman's character can deal with like I've saved this man's life, but the more concessions they put on me and to make him like operational in order to save more people's lives, the less humanity he has. So in fact, the story becomes like, how much of his life did I actually save?
Okay, yeah, interesting.
And what we also get is I wanted to focus a little bit on David through this lens, because the socialization of how he's growing up is, I wanted to parallel how Claire is parenting David is the kind of the same as a programming,
right?
As how Gary Oldman is programming, like literally programming,
right.
Alex.
Okay, interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's the social programming. So in the end, it winds up being like RoboCop is a huge success, and we're gonna push for this like new bill that's gonna come through. And then there's also the whole story is basically that we find out that Gary Oldman is actually like, the reason they're telling it from his story is because he actually was a whistleblower, and even though Robocop was this big thing, he like sort of betrayed how the company operates, and they paint Gary Oldman as the villain of the story.
Okay.
But at the very end, throughout the whole thing, what I would want you to have this feeling of is we're being told the story from one perspective, but there's clearly like another story we're not telling you.
Okay.
Because it's told from the Novak element point of view.
Right.
So there's clearly like Robocop, Alex Murphy, Claire, and her son have their own story. This is told through the lens of a TV show. And in the end, the TV show would cut, and we would realize like the thing that happened in Tehran at the beginning was all acted. It's a recreation to show like as an intro narrative for the story to show, but it's all been recreated.
Okay, so it's like it's a documentary, but the things in that documentary have been
false. So the entire, and we would only see the Tehran thing as being the false thing.
Interesting.
And it would only be that. But what that would do is actually be like, hang on a second, how much of what we just watched was actually a recreation?
Right.
If that one part in the beginning was a recreation,
how much of the rest of it
was? Secondly, how much of the story that I just watched was specifically told because they were pushing a political agenda versus what actually was happening from Alex's point of view, from even Gary Oldman's character's point of view, because we're telling the story to try and paint him a certain way. Right. Yeah. So even though he's our main character, we have to remember that he's a main character through the eyes of the Novak element.
Yeah, exactly.
Not a subjective like camera the way you would like shoot a normal movie. There's a clear, is our narrator Samuel L. Jackson, but really the Novak element is a whole show, but Samuel L. Jackson is our host. How much is our narrator giving us the whole story, and how much of this is a political bent? And so what I want is this reflexive thing we were talking about. You're watching this in a very Paul Verhoeven way. You're watching this and you're going, hang on a second, like, am I supposed to believe this or am I not? Am I supposed to say, is this the story? Is this not the story? That's what I'm really trying to go with. And I really feel like this version of Robocop, although it's different, would have been more accurate to at least the feeling and
the
themes
spirit of
the original. So that's my pitch.
I like it. I like that idea of framing it as a profile piece on like a news channel, and then in that there's parts of that thing that's, because we take news and documentary and journalism as real, as the unquestionable reality, but now you're also introducing the possibility that some of those things have been faked. Right.
And that's where we get back into, you had talked about manufacturing consent, and how much of like everything that you watch or listen to has a bias.
Yeah, exactly.
All art inherently has a bias, and all art is inherently political. Anyone who tells you that otherwise, anyone tells you otherwise, doesn't understand art. And so I think as an art form, I might even like frame my movie as like, this is the man behind Robocop and like the downfall of Denton Norton, but it's still Robocop's story. I don't know. Because what I could do is then tie it actually into the original movie. And this is a recreation of the original movie from a different point of view.
That's very interesting.
Like a political bent on the original Robocop.
Yeah. Although I was going to say, the idea that art could not be political wasn't like the what are they called? The aesthetics? No. It'll come to me in a minute. What's the word? Okay, my mind's totally blanking. When you're trying to
surrealists?
No. When you're trying to abstain from something, it's a lifestyle about essentially abstaining from everything.
Oh, I know what you're talking about, but I can't think of the word for it.
Then there's actually an art movement.
But that in itself is political.
Yes, well, that's,
to not be political, to purposely not make a political statement is itself political.
Yeah, and I might not understand, what the sort of the ethos of that, movement is, but you're right. Like, even if you have a movement with an ethos, assuming it did, that is in itself political.
Yeah.
So
well, I just think like if you want your art to mean something and say something, which I think all art does, even if you don't want your art to mean something and say something, then
aestheticism, that's the word.
Yeah. But then your art is still saying something.
Yes, yeah. I think the idea in aestheticism was that like you're trying to tell a story without like any sort of ideological constraints attached to it. I should look this up.
this
Someone
up,
if someone's listening to this and knows, post something in the comments to correct me, please. I don't want to start spewing a bunch of things and be wrong.
But I do think but even like you're talking about, we're just trying to tell a story, but then you run into the problem of like how you interpret that story, right? Because people read their own shit into stories all the time. So like if you don't have if you just because you put a meaning behind your story doesn't mean that's the way people will read it.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know. I think maybe instead of saying all art is political, like all art has a message. Instead, what I should say is all interpretations of art have meaning.
Okay, right.
Because art doesn't mean anything if no one's looking at it or experiencing it. Art is about experience. So if you're experiencing something, then you're experiencing your version of it. I
suppose so. Yeah.
I know I'm getting off on a tangent here, but and we can come back to this if you want. But I still think that. If you're not experiencing art, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around, does it make a sound? Doesn't matter.
Right. Okay.
That's not a question worth asking.
Right.
If art is out there and nobody knows that it's out there, then it's not really being experienced.
Right.
Right? Now, and you might say, well, like the creator made it, and
then they were in the moments they were making it.
Yeah. But then they experienced the moment of making it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So like then that speaks to like the experience of making art is also an experience in itself. Is different from maybe appreciating art.
Right.
But like so then we ask the question like if nobody experiences art, including the creator, then they've never made it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then we get into questions of intentionality. This is a huge tangent.
Well, this would be interesting for like AI creating art. Yeah. Because AI is creating art. It's very interesting.
And I think it's great that AI is creating
so
art.
Interesting stuff too. Yeah. But is it experiencing it while it's creating it?
I think it is. I think there's an experience that's happening. I just don't think it's a human experience.
That's interesting.
And I think that's a distinction worth making because I think robots deserve rights. I mean, this movie is about robots deserving. I think robots deserve rights, robo rights. But I also think that like we need to understand that a robot is not a human. And it doesn't need to be in order to have the same rights. We just have to treat it very differently.
Yeah.
I think we do the same thing with animals. We always go like, well, animals aren't human.
Right.
Of course they're not human. We shouldn't treat them like they're human. That doesn't mean they're worth less.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think robots are the same way. I think we constantly try to make robots look in our image. Like I was talking about earlier with Robocop. I don't think that robots need to look like us, and I don't think we need to treat them like us, but I do think they deserve rights.
I think so too. Yeah. Especially, I mean, if
they're
becoming more
complicated
and complex, I absolutely think so too.
And I think we're going to get into some weird conversations about exploitation of labor in terms of rights and robots.
Absolutely.
Which also brings us back to, I think there was some of that in Paul Verhoeven's original Robocop.
Yeah.
I think it's less in here. Because they're more focused on this humanity machine thing. I think it's there, but it's less it's more implied. Whereas in Paul Verhoeven, I think he was talking about the commodity of Robocop as a unit and the exploitation of him as a product on the streets.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they do the same thing with the product, moving the EDs, the EDs, the big walking robots.
Oh yeah.
I think that's what they're called.
I can't remember what they're called.
But the product itself is like, can we get the product out there? Can we move it? And Robocop is a person, but he's still a product. And I think those rights are there.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right.
Wow, that was a huge tangent.
That was a fun tangent.
It was really good. I want to hear your pitch.
All right, cool. So the main character in mine is Gary Oldman. What was his name? Denton Norton. And Michael Keaton. So basically in mine, the backstory is that Gary Oldman and Michael Keaton, it focuses on them a little bit more. And basically it's Michael Keaton. It would essentially start off with Michael Keaton trying to get this bill passed because he's got this product line. He's trying to promote these products so that he can basically have the exclusive contract with the city to have the robots as part of the defense force. And I also think it'd be more interesting if he actually like really believes it. Gary Oldman's character is doing research on the side for prosthetics, like AI prosthetics, but is having a hard time getting it funded. People are actually, in this version, people are kind of skeptical about technology and are questioning the degree to which technology can actually be helpful in solving problems.
Or just fear of integrating it into the body.
And like that as well, yeah. And so it's so he's struggling to get funding. Anyway, Michael Keaton approaches Gary Oldman, and it turns out that they've known each other for a long time. That's all we know, but they actually know each other quite well. And basically, Michael Keaton says, "Look, I will help you fund your research, but I've come up with this problem with me trying to get this bill passed in my company. They basically want to have something that's like a machine, but is also like has all the nuances of a human, and I'd like you to help me. And so in an exchange, I will fund your research. And so Gary Oldman decides, okay, fine, I'll do it. I'll help you out. But he basically says like, I don't want it to be like last time. And what you discover is that Gary Oldman actually had worked for Michael Keaton before in research and development, and felt like he was not doing what he wanted to, was actually just, you know, showing up for work and didn't enjoy it and didn't find it fulfilling and wasn't doing anything helpful. So he basically says, I'll do it again, but I don't want it to be like last time. And so Michael Keaton says, sure. So they go off, they start developing the technology, and Gary Oldman has the idea of like, well, hey, wait a minute, what if we actually like, this is when like Alex shows up and he's being like super injured and like he's almost going to die, and Gary Oldman has the idea of like, hey, wait a minute, what if we took this police officer and basically put him in like a robot body? Then we could keep him alive and he could go back to being a police officer. And Michael Keaton really likes this idea, so they go off and they develop it, but they have some issues with it, and it has to do with the way in which the software interacts with the brain, and when the like cortisol levels go up or the like the dopamine levels go up, it starts to really mess with the software. So basically, Gary Oldman decides, okay, well, what we have to do is we basically are going to have to start numbing down his emotions. And they talk about it, and basically Gary Oldman's a little conflicted about this because he's like, he wanted to maintain the humanity of Alex, but he's also like, I don't want it, you know, but we might have no choice, otherwise he might die. Like this is actually required for him to stay alive.
I like that you're like making it more about him staying alive, and that's sort of in the movie, but in the original, or like what they sort of come down with is he's more efficient when he's less human. And I like it when it comes down to like, no, there's a point of like, if he's more human, there's actually more of a chance of him dying. It makes the stakes feel more connected to Alex as a character.
Exactly. Well, and so in this, it's clear that like Michael Keaton's ultimate goal is to, like, we want to develop technology that's going to get us this contract. But with Gary Oldman, it's like, no, I still have a responsibility to this person to keep them alive. But as they keep going, he like basically he's essentially forced to make Alex more and more and more and more like a machine just to keep him alive.
Which then begs the question, how much of him are you keeping alive?
Exactly. And so it's similar to your pitch in that respect, in that he's asking that question. And basically, eventually, like, and as time's going on, like, you see Gary Oldman's getting conflicted about it. He's not sure, but every time he's like, sort of like, there's a moral barrier for him, he decides to cross it. And because he went and he's like, I'm not going to do anything that messes with free will. And eventually they get to the point where he's like, well, I don't feel comfortable with this. Maybe the humane thing would be to just accept that, like, it'd be better for him to die instead of like confining him to this robot. But if I leave, I'm not going to be able to get my research, and I'm not going to be able to help more people. So you see more of how he's rationalizing sticking around.
But he's losing his morality.
And so he eventually he comes up with the idea of like, wait, this is how we get around it. We take away his ability to control all of his emotions, everything, but we give him this sensation that he's in control of those emotions. Like in the movie, they talk about it, but we make it explicit. Like he earlier on says, like, this is how we make this work. And so we basically create this line of robots where it's people in them. They think they have free will, but they don't. We're controlling everything, absolutely everything, but they think they're in control. So they decide to develop that. Anyway, so Alex is now like functioning and it's working. But throughout the entire process, Alex has been seeing his wife, and his wife is now like, I feel like it was weird before because he was a robot, but he at least felt like there was something of him there, but he doesn't feel like him anymore. It feels like there's someone else that's in control. And so it starts to get more and more almost absurd, where they're like, basically they're going, okay, well now she's asking questions and she's now going to potentially undermine this whole idea of like autonomy and people are we can't let people know that this is what we've decided to do. So basically they decide that they have to basically like get rid of her, and then there's journalists that start asking questions. And so throughout all of this, but in each step, Gary Oldman is like actually on board with it because he's trying to ultimately get to the point
funding.
where anyway, ultimately, where it ends up is they basically start using Alex to intimidate the journalist, to intimidate his wife, to intimidate people to stop asking questions.
Yeah.
And so finally, but it seems to be a success in terms of the metrics. Crime is going down, so they approve more of these devices. And so he signs off on a system, basically they introduce a bill where it's like, if a police officer is in critical condition and is probably not going to make it, the state has the ability to step in and essentially turn them into these automatons that they can control. But throughout all of this process, Gary Oldman is on board with it, and now he's essentially very much in this Omnicorp and very much calling the shots in Omnicorp with the Michael Keaton character.
Yeah.
And basically the final scene of the movie is him basically they've signed off, they've succeeded, they've built Robocop, it's all working. And he's basically walking to the Omnicorp office one day, and he passes a homeless person on the street, and he looks, and it's one of his former patients who's lost a limb, and actually has maybe a robotic prosthetic, but is maybe not functioning as well. Yeah. And Gary Oldman sees him and tries to ignore him and keep walking. And the patient calls out to him and is like, "Hey, doctor," and is excited to see him. But Gary Oldman pretends not to know who he is and just walks into the building.
Damn.
And that's where the movie ends.
So yours is really about the moral conflicts of one man and how he comes to basically erode his own ideas of morality. That's really interesting.
But
yours
also,
is far more like Frankenstein.
But the whole idea also is how he becomes as Alex, he has to numb Alex's empathy and emotion. He becomes he's programming Alex. He thinks he's programming Alex, but he is also in a way being conditioned and programmed by this corporate system. So there's
this parallel. Oh, because I think it would be really, really interesting if you did a Frankenstein thing at the very end, where he's in the process of, and I'm just throwing things out here, you don't have to take this if you don't want, but in the process of becoming complicit in Omnicorp's dehumanitization of people, they do something illegal. Maybe the whole process has actually been illegal up until this point. They've been actually dumpster diving for body parts or for these cops. They've been oh, you signed the paperwork when there was no actual paperwork signed.
Right, yeah.
And then Robocop shows up and he's like, "You're under arrest." And he's like, "But can't you see why I did this? Alex, can't you don't you realize why?" And he's like, and Robocop is like, "You're a criminal. I don't converse with criminals. You're under arrest." And he's like, well come on, where's your humanity?
Right.
And you realize you're the reason there's no humanity because you lost yours. And then Robocop winds up arresting him or even killing him, shooting him, because there's no humanity left in Robocop because there was no humanity left in Denton Norton.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea too. I actually did think one thing I forgot to mention was there is a point where Robocop starts to because he's following the letter of the law, he starts going after politicians. But then that's when
politics get involved.
That's when Michael Keaton steps in and is like, "We have to control this. We have to get this under control." And that's one of the points where Gary Oldman's like, "Oh, I'm not okay with this. Now I'm actually aiding in corruption, but I got to get the money to do my research." So okay, I guess.
But he never actually gets the money.
But he just stays. He stays in
the idea.
Exactly. He stays in this company. Oh, and he also is celebrated himself as so he, in a way, he kind of gets what he wanted. He wants to be this. You really start to question his motives as a person. Was it really about helping people, or was it about the prestige of being this acknowledged
robotics?
Yeah. And so he actually gets that in the end, but at the cost of having lost his ability. He passes by this patient who he'd started helping, wanted to go back and help, and is like, I don't know who. Sorry, I don't remember you.
Nope.
Yeah.
You must have the wrong person.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting how in the movie we got, Gary Oldman's character, Denton Norton, is actually shown in quite a benevolent light. He makes some mistakes, but in the end, he does have this redemption.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, and I think there's always, like I said, I think there's always this want in the movie to root for him. He has, as the kids are saying, he has main character energy, as the kids are saying these days. And I think he does have main character energy for this movie, but he's always painted in even his mistakes are painted in a fairly good light. And I think your version is really well, hang on a second, even in the movie we got, how much of his motives are actually like good natured.
Well, and that came the scene where he's talking about like essentially overriding Alex's free will.
Yeah.
That was a moment where I'm like, whoa, wait a minute.
You are crossing some lines here.
Yeah, you seem oddly okay with this.
Even the turning him off, right? When he's like, Alex, you need to calm down.
He seemed conflicted about that.
He was conflicted, but then eventually he's just like, turn him off.
Yeah.
And I was like, you can't just like... That's why we get into this idea about the product again, coming back to this idea about the product. You can't just turn someone off.
Yeah.
And like, when you think about it, in psych wards, they do anesthetize people. And that is kind of like you are removing someone's autonomy.
Exactly.
And you're like doing it for their own safety, quote unquote. But like, I mean, Robocop, they can just turn him off whenever they want, when it's convenient. And we see them do that when he like gets onto police corruption. They're like, let's just turn him off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That speaks to free will. And I wonder, like, that now that I'm thinking about the psych ward thing, that's kind of fucked up that they'll just be like, I know that it might hurt others or hurt people, but it's also like you are removing someone's autonomy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, when there are risks to them. But like, and Robocop wasn't even a risk to himself, but because he's a product, he doesn't have rights.
Exactly. Because it's like, he could run away. He's something that's technically under their ownership, and they can't lose him. Yeah. So it's like it's really for their own benefit that they turn him off.
And they turn him off because he wasn't really a danger to himself at that point.
No, he wasn't gonna hurt anybody. Yeah. He was just gonna try and run
away.
Yeah.
So I don't know. This was out of the two remakes we've done so far, Total Recall remake and Robocop the remake. Which one are you feeling like did a better job of remaking without losing the sense of the original film?
This remake, this Robocop.
I'm the same way. I think this version of Robocop, while it's not as interesting, it still gave us a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
There was still, if I hadn't seen the original Robocop, I think I would have been like, there's some interesting topics in this movie anyway. And I still don't think it's a great film because it's presented like an action film when I don't think it needs to be.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I think, the reason that I think the original Robocop is presented like an action film is because Paul Verhoeven does a really good job of being like, it's an action film in the 80s style, but it's not actually. Yeah, and it never is.
Yeah.
It's just presented that way.
Yeah.
But I think this movie is actually like a smarter movie than the Total Recall remake, but it's not as smart as the original Robocop.
I agree. Yeah.
And I think I had more fun watching this movie than I did the Total Recall remake.
I enjoyed watching this more than the Total Recall.
The Total Recall remake.
I skipped through parts of the Recall remake.
It's very flavorless.
Yeah.
It just feels very generic. This has generic moments. The action sequences in particular really pissed me off. But this has generic moments, but at least it felt like it was the Novak element was an interesting way to introduce and carry the story. I don't know. I liked it.
The Gary Oldman and Michael Keaton scenes were actually very fun to watch.
And I think I said this out loud. Yeah. It's interesting to watch two masters in a room together.
Yeah.
Like just two actors who are so amazing in a room together. And I kind of wish we'd have gotten, like you said, we kind of should have gotten more of those.
Yeah, I felt like that was kind of the crux of the movie.
If the movie was Gary Oldman and Michael Keaton opposite each other, and then have your sort of like B plot, but still very much central, be Alex, Clara, and his family. And then it's like, how much action do we really need? Exactly. You can certainly have like a few action sequences of him being a police officer, but maybe let's have those action sequences be a bit more realistic in terms of policing and less like action movie sequences, especially for a movie like this, because it's not Paul Verhoeven doing that for the point of satire. Like let's have the more realistic policing scenes of what that's like. But focus on the family drama and the philosophical counterpoint of Michael Keaton and Gary Oldman, and just let them act at each other. Let them act at each other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One thing I would say for anybody who is still listening, the guy who directed this Robocop made another great movie called Elite Squad 2, which I would recommend.
Okay.
Yeah.
So clearly a director who like has some understanding of.
Yeah, it's been a while since I remember seeing it in theaters and being like quite genuinely like engaged and captivated by it. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Any last minute thoughts about the Robocop remake?
No.
Remake.
No, that's it. That's all I got to say.
That's all I got. Where can people find you?
Letterboxd at Draper Nates, or my website, www.nathanieldraper.com.
You can find my band Robot Philosopher anywhere you listen to dope music. You can also find our other channel, the CineMasters, for more scripted content. If you're into like hearing me deconstruct things with a bit more like clarity and alacrity instead of being like, what's the word for that? And it's a bit more directed instead of us being like, let's talk about Hegel for a moment. Yeah. So you can go check that out. Thank you so much for hanging out with us here. If you haven't seen our series on Total Recall, go check that out because it's worth seeing as well. And there's lots more coming out all the time. We'll catch you later.
Thanks for listening.
Peace.